June 3, 23 BC, Babylon, the master of the known world, barely 32 years old, lies sweating in a bed of silk and gold. He cannot speak. His generals circle him like vultures, waiting for him to die so they can tear his empire apart. May 1821, St. Helena, a desolate rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Another man lies in a damp room, staring at the patterns on the wallpaper. He too was once the master of the world, but now he fights with his English guards over the cost of firewood. Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte. 2,000 years separate them, but they lived the exact same life. They redrew maps with the tips of their swords. They convinced millions to walk into the jaws of death with a single word. But they were not defeated by enemy armies. They were not defeated by winter or assassins. They were destroyed by the only enemy they could not conquer, their own minds. This is not a war story. This is the anatomy of the disease of victory. This is the story of the God complex. To understand the end, we must look at the beginning, because for men like this, normal was never an option. Alexander was the son of a king, but his mother whispered to him that his true father was Zeus. He slept with the Iliad under his pillow. He didn't want to be a king. He wanted to be Achilles. He wanted to be immortal. Napoleon was born in Corsica, a minor noble mocked for his accent, but he possessed the fastest mind history has ever seen. He saw the chaos of the French Revolution not as a tragedy, but as a ladder to be climbed. Both men experienced a breaking point, a moment that convinced them they were untouchable. For Alexander, it was the taming of Bucephalus. He realized the horse wasn't wild, but simply afraid of its own shadow. He turned the beast toward the sun, and the fear vanished. Watching this, his father wept and said, "Macedon is too small for you." For Napoleon, it was the siege of Toulouse. He saw the geometric angle no one else could see, placed the cannons, and broke the British fleet. In that moment, he believed he was not a man, but a force of nature. It is a dangerous thing to never lose, because when you win, every time you stop believing in luck, you start believing in your own divinity. At the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander was outnumbered 5-1. His generals advised a night attack. Alexander refused. "I will not steal my victory," he said, and he won. At Austerlitz, Napoleon drew the enemy into the exact trap he wanted. When the battle ended, the map of Europe was his desk. This is where the poisoning begins. Alexander took the priests in Egypt seriously when they declared him the son of Ammon. He was no longer a general, he was a living god. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands in Notre Dame Cathedral and placed it on his own head. He didn't need God, he was the state. But there is a price to being a god: solitude. As they elevated themselves, they began to humiliate the friends who put them there. In a drunken rage at a banquet, Alexander killed Cletus, the man who had saved his life with his own hands, simply because Cletus criticized him. Napoleon accused his most loyal marshals, who begged for peace, of cowardice. He made his brothers kings and chose blood over merit. When there is no one left around you who can say no, the brakes are gone on the road to disaster. Every tragedy has a peak, the moment the hero goes too far. For Alexander, it was India. For Napoleon, it was Russia. These were not strategic necessities, these were ego wars. Alexander wanted to reach the end of the world. He dragged his men through monsoon rains and against war elephants. At the Hyaphasis River, the soldiers finally broke. "We will go no further," they said. Alexander sulked in his tent like a child, but his punishment was cruel. On the return, he marched them through the desert. 60 days of hell. He lost 3/4 of his army, not to battle, but to thirst and heat. Napoleon's mistake was identical, only the temperature changed. 1812, he entered Russia with 600,000 men. The Russians didn't fight. They retreated. They burned their own villages, their own fields. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found flames, not victory. The retreat was an apocalypse. In 30 degrees below zero, soldiers ate their horses, even each other. Of the 600,000, only walking corpses returned. Napoleon left them in that white hell and fled to Paris to save his throne. Nature did not care about their godhood. As Alexander took his last breath in Babylon, they asked him, "To whom do you leave your empire?" He whispered, "To the strongest." He knew.
He knew the world he built could not survive without him, and it didn't. His generals tore it apart. Napoleon died on St. Helena, dictating his memoirs, trying to secure his place in history. His last words were, "France, the army, Josephine." Why do we still talk about them? Why do we admire men who burned the world? Because Alexander and Napoleon were the greatest experiment in the limits of human will. They showed us how one person can change the shape of the world, but they also taught us the cost. They conquered empires, but they could not conquer their own arrogance. They flew too close to the sun and they burned. And the only truth that remains is this: history is written by the winners, but time only remembers the losers. If you want us to explore more of these psychological turning points in history, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Who was more tragic, the prince who died young or the emperor who lost everything? See you in the next video.